Hi, Dr. Karen Doll. Thank you for your being here with us today. Could you
Thanks, Carmen.
could you share a little about yourself?
Sure. Yes, I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the U.S.
Mhm.
And I'm a psychologist, and I've always been in workplace mental health. I operate as a consultant and a coach, and it's interesting because I feel like I've always operated and worked in workplace mental health. I just haven't been able to call it that until the last few years, now that there's a little more awareness. So I
Mhm.
do a lot of individual coaching and group coaching and speaking about resilience and such topics like psychological fitness.
Mhm. And in fact, you have written a book about building psychological fitness. How did that come about? What spurred you on to actually put it into writing?
Yes, so my book is Building Psychological Fitness, and the subtitle is How High Performers Achieve with Ease.
Mhm.
And how it came to be, it was a kind of a COVID project. And when we were in 2020, I had a pretty high volume of coaching clients that I was meeting with. And so I was struck by the strong language that people were using around their emotional struggle. And I even started keeping track of the words that people were using. I'm struggling, I'm overwhelmed, I'm exhausted, I'm languishing.
Mhm.
And I think it was a Wednesday morning. I counted, I had heard the word struggle or struggling 27 times or
Mhm.
28
Wow.
times or something.
Mhm.
And what sparked me to write the book was that I was hearing about this from people in coaching conversations, yet I think people were what was compounding it was just the feeling of aloneness and people having the sense that they are the only one that's struggling. And why does everybody else make this look so easy? And
Mhm.
so that was what sparked me to write the book, is to
Mhm.
have some of this well-being and mental health practices that are accessible to people. And I selected the title psychological fitness just so that the implication is that we can operate out of an asset-based approach, and that this is something that we can all work on and improve. It's developable.
Mhm.
So I wanted just to reinforce the message that, if you're struggling, you're not the only one. And there are some things that we can do to have agency
Mhm.
over managing our mental health.
Mhm. That certainly is very encouraging, to know that the struggle itself is not the end, and that there is actually a way forward, right? If only we could, yeah, learn the strategies for coping and managing that's, whether it's stress or burnout, yeah. And so could you tell us a little about some of the factors that actually contribute to burnout and chronic stress? You did mention that it became more apparent during the pandemic, but I suppose it's something that, do you think it's something that has always been there and just came to the fore because of the pandemic?
Yes. So, and I would love to just reinforce your comment about hope, because we
Mhm.
do have to focus on hope and what we can do,
Mhm.
because the alternative is that we become victims to our circumstance, or the alternative is we begin to feel hopelessness or helplessness.
Yeah.
Um, so I really believe that there is power in remembering that
Mhm.
regardless of the adversity or the stressors that we're dealing with, there are things that we can do to get through it and to overcome.
Mhm.
And so chronic stress and burnout, yes, I think it has always been there. I think right now in knowledge work, there is a kind of a hustle culture, and in
Mhm.
our culture there certainly is a hustle culture. And so, I mean, chronic stress has always been there, and basically what that is mismanaged stress,
Mhm.
or not having proper rest and recovery so that our systems are able to kind of get restoration and get back to baseline.
Mhm.
So if chronic stress is not addressed, or if stress is not addressed, I mean, we all have stress, but there are healthy ways that we can cope with it. So there are all kinds of health risks associated with mismanaging stress and not having that proper recovery. I mean, chronic stress contributes to all kinds of physical ailments and mental ailments, of course.
Mhm.
Burnout, you know, the signposts of burnout are exhaustion, feelings of inefficacy, which is simply I don't feel as effective as I normally do,
Mhm.
and then an attitude of skepticism.
Mhm.
And the distinction, the distinction between chronic stress and burnout, there certainly is some overlap and intersection.
Mhm.
I think one of the differentiating factors is that feeling of noticing a change in attitude about work, where
Mhm.
people who are most at risk for burnout, frankly, are high performers who work really hard and care a lot about what they do and find purpose and passion and meaning in their work. Those are the people that are the most at risk for burnout. And it can be kind of a slow fade. We can drift into it and then it can be too late. And burnout is no joke. It is a real condition that can take people quite a long time to
Mhm.
recover from it. So I think one of the differentiating factors is that change of attitude about work when people all of a sudden find themselves saying things like, oh, you know, what's the point? Why should I even bother?
Mhm.
And kind of
Mhm.
that more negative attitude about work can signify burnout. And there are all kinds of risk factors that contribute to burnout,
Mhm.
workplace factors, as well as
Mhm.
individual factors.
Mhm.
Probably the most obvious one is excessive workload or having an imbalance of demand and capacity.
Mhm. Mhm.
So organizations have a responsibility there, managers have a responsibility, and I always say it's shared accountability because we as individuals also, of course, are responsible for managing our own well-being and mental health.
Mhm. So it does sound like there is also a need for individuals to learn to manage their boundaries and to know, when it's enough, that work is enough. And I was just wondering, really learning when and how to recuperate from chronic stress or increasing our tolerance to stress can be helpful. This was some of the things that you mentioned. So what are some of the ways in which somebody can actually learn, to manage that stress or to learn to recognize it and come out of it? Yeah.
Yes. So yes, managing the boundaries, that's a big one. And that's a scary thing to do. People have a lot of fear about pushing back
Mm-hmm.
at work. I don't want my manager
Mm-hmm.
to think I can't handle it. I don't want don't want to let my team down. There are all kinds of sort of inner critic mental models that can come into place. Yet it is important, and it's important for people to learn how to have those conversations, because organizations are an entity and they will take
Mm.
as much from us generally as we're willing to give.
Yes.
So, so how to stay ahead of that? Um, well, I have 385 pages written
Mm-hmm.
about written about how to do that, but I would say, a lot of people align with the idea of thinking of how to manage your energy. So anything with effective self-regulation, we have top-down strategies. So those would be managing our thinking, challenging maladaptive thought patterns, and right-sizing our thinking about situations. And even what we call stress matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea is we want to reduce unnecessary distress
Mm-hmm.
and then just properly manage day-to-day stress or adversity that we're facing. So what we call the stress matters, and there's research that shows, with one group of people, if they're told and educated on how stress can be enhancing, and then there's another group that's told how debilitating stress is. So if we follow these two groups over the course of 6 weeks, there's a difference in their health symptoms. So the people that are told and learn about how stress can be enhancing have increased health benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So what we call the stress, the story we tell ourselves about it matters. And I sometimes will tell the story about I have 5 kids, and my oldest son, Stephen, when he was 12, was in this baseball tournament, a national baseball tournament. And so this was however many years ago. And he had these very intense coaches, and it was the first game of this tournament. Everybody's so nervous. Half of the kids are crying in the dugout. And I heard the coaches say to my son before the game, Stephen, the team rolls how you roll. And I thought, how stressful. Why would you put that kind of pressure on a kid? Um, but he was always that kid, and still is now, this young adult who's able to show up in high pressure situations and perform. So at the tournament, he is the first guy up to bat, and he swings at the first pitch, which you're not ever supposed to do, but he did, and he hit a home run. So everybody's tension just decreased just a little bit. And at the end of the game, I said, Stephen, you must have been so nervous. How did you do that? And he looked at me and said, oh, no, I don't call it that. I call it excited. So this was my 12-year-old son giving his psychologist mother a peak performance principle. So he has all the same probably symptoms in his body about being excited or nervous, whatever we want to call it. And that is what prepares us for a situation to be alert. He was just interpreting it as a good thing, like I'm ready, rather than I'm panicking. So even that, what we call the experience matters. So we can do top-down strategies, modifying our thinking. Again, what is the story we're telling us ourselves, and trying to avoid catastrophizing or cognitive distortions. Bottom-up strategies are how do we find ways to calm the nervous system? And that could be through breathing, it could be through movement, it could be through stretching. The breath is a very short and effective way to calm the nervous system. And then what I mentioned about just this idea of energy management, I think it's helpful for high achievers in particular to think about this model, which is that if you think we only have so much energy in a 24-hour period, so I think of it as mental, emotional, or cognitive, emotional, physical, and spiritual. And within that 24-hour period, if we don't replenish those energy sources, we will no longer be effective. So it's not negotiable. There's human limitation that we all have. If we don't rest and sleep, we will literally die. And so trying to get a little more in tune with managing that energy, and the example is often given, corporate athletes, we tend to not be as effective at taking breaks and managing our energy. Elite athletes, physical athletes who are in training for something, are much more in tune with this. So they treat their rest and recovery time just as important as their most intense workout, because they know it's critical for performance. So how that applies to knowledge workers, I think, is just getting a little more in tune with what are the rhythms, being more reasonable about our expectations, modifying our expectations, taking breaks, making sure we're getting physical exercise. Physical exertion is a great way to manage stress, because if we exert ourselves, our bodies, our system's natural response is to go back to homeostasis. So exertion, if we physically exert ourselves, our system will naturally kind of get back to baseline. So what's problematic is many people are running around with like an elevated level of stress without really properly getting back to a healthy mode. And that's where the effects of chronic stress can build and have kind of residual impact.
So having that, definitely recognizing one's limitations is beneficial, right? Because we're not machines. It's really recognizing how far we can go, and that's part of knowing ourselves as well, a little more holistically, I suppose. And I think it was really interesting that you talked about perspective, because the problems can be the same, but the way we approach the problems will determine our mental health being in that sense. You know, if we're going to see it as a threat, then naturally it's going to create more stress for us than perhaps the situation warrants. Yeah, so that's really, really interesting. Yeah, it's very insightful there. And so for the longest time, there has been also a kind of a misconception that stress and poor mental health is the price to pay for achievement. And since you do work with many high achievers, how can we really align mental well-being and high achievement career path? You know, because sometimes there is this sensation that you mentioned earlier also, that we have to make, if in order to rest, we have to make sacrifices and we have to give certain things up, and maybe we'll be lagging behind in the rat race. So could you comment on that?
Sure. Yes, I think it's a really, like I was saying, it's like the $1,000,000 question is, can I be a high achiever and
Exactly.
elevate and advance without compromising
Yeah.
my well-being and my health and my leisure time and whatnot? And honestly, I think we're all trying to sort through that. And I think we have to have hope that it's possible. Some industries are probably, it's probably more challenging. So a very common question that comes up in coaching is people who maybe work in a consulting firm and they say, okay, I want path to partner, but I'm noticing the partners are working 80 hours a week, or they're not seeing their families or whatever. So is it possible for me to have somewhat, even though I don't like the term balanced, you know, a life that we're able to have things besides work and time outside of work? So I have to believe that it's possible. And the other thing is, you know, there's the law of diminishing returns. If we work over X amount of hours in a week, we are just simply no longer going to be effective. And so the overwork isn't really a solution. And I think cutting back and scaling back, we get sort of habitual, we get into habitual overwork mode. And we all have a need to bring value. Of course, you know, we all want to do work that matters, and we all want to matter at work. But there's a lot of noise and static out there around busyness being a little bit like a badge of honor. So I believe, yes, it's possible to be a high achiever and to work and have a fulfilling, successful career without excessive compromise. We can't do all the things or be all the things at one time, but there certainly are even just little levers and changes that people can make over time can really have a compound impact.
That's really great news for all of us, you know, to realize that the two things are compatible, and sometimes less is more, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, and that's part of how I came up with my subtitle, which is basically, you know, can we perform and still feel at ease? And how I came up with that was just, I interviewed people for the book. I interviewed high achieving people. And I was trying to get their language of what is your desirable state? Like, what is it that you're going for? And there were 20, I say this in the beginning of my book, I had 27 interviews in a row that were all recorded that ended with people saying, I just want to feel at ease. So it's this notion that people are having this kind of internal state of distress, and they just want to feel a little better. They want to feel less tension.
So if people are interested in becoming more psychologically and mentally fit, what are some of the first steps they could take towards, you know, changing their mindset or their lifestyle? Reading your book, perhaps?
Well, that's the first thing I would endorse, of course. Yes. No, but seriously, there is a lot of material out there about these strategies and positive psychology interventions, and, you know, how can we build resilience, and even learning about this stuff, and psychoeducation in and of itself tends to help well-being, just because it raises awareness. So if I would encourage people, I always think of how do we best flourish? And that is managing like those elements of well-being. So obviously attending to general wellness things, getting enough sleep and eating healthy and all the things that we know that we should be doing, but we don't always do. Tapping into your sense of purpose, like where are you really finding meaning in your work? Managing your energy and attention. So making some observations of, what's filling my bucket, what's depleting my bucket, where can I put some deposits in? What fuels me? Where am I getting rest and recovery? And then really the power of interpersonal connection and being in community and relationships, engaging in pro-social behaviors, which is just simply like a small act of kindness for somebody or an act of service, tends to be the fastest way to elevate our mental health and well-being.
I really liked the fact that you mentioned, finding meaning in what you're doing. And I just wonder, how is that achievable or possible? Could you just comment a little more about that?
Yes. So purpose and passion and meaning, they're sort of big, vague concepts. So to make it a little more practical, we are happiest when we're engaged in something. So I might think, oh, I think I'd be really happy sitting on the beach drinking a pina colada. That would be pleasant, but we really tend to be happiest when we're engaged because it fosters a sense of self-efficacy and agency. So I think the easiest way to think about purpose is if we are finding ways to learn and grow and develop ourselves and contribute to something beyond ourselves. That could be in the micro or in the macro. We're not all saving babies every day. But it could be, how do I just bring a little bit of goodness and contribute to something beyond myself just today or this morning or when I'm at the grocery store. So it doesn't need to be such a grand thing. And I think purpose is, again, anything that we're contributing that's healthy and will promote the flourishing of people around us.
So you talked a little about the importance of human connection, and I wonder if that is in any way related to also finding meaning in the things you do.
Yes. So loneliness is really also a big, like an epidemic right now. A lot of people are struggling with loneliness, even though we are in this virtually connected world. And there are studies, probably the biggest longitudinal study that has ever been done in this realm at Harvard tells us that the power of connection is the #1 predictor of longevity. And so the connection with people, of course, yes, brings meaning. If you think about all the special moments in your life, or if you reflect on special moments, it almost always is with another human or with people. So we cannot flourish in a vacuum. In order for us to flourish as humans, we have to do it together.
So that would mean even the connections that in the workplace has an impact on well-being in the workplace, right? But sometimes the workplace can be so competitive as well. So is it really possible to have authentic, connections in the workplace, and how do people navigate workplace relationships?
Yes, there's a lot of conversation about that these days with people wanting to bring their whole selves to work, and how do we be authentic but not too authentic, and how do we connect and have meaningful dialogue without over disclosing. So I think that, there are different contexts and different types of relationships that we're going to get different things from. And sometimes just having a regular daily conversation about simple things, whether it's the weather or the sports or news, there's a place for that. So every interaction doesn't need to be something where we're sharing our deepest, darkest concerns with one another. So I think, there's a continuum. There are people that we can have maybe a little more surface interaction. I mean, the power of an interaction we underestimate. Even connecting and saying hello to a stranger is enhancing to the brain and well-being. And we don't think that it would be, but even that is helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Karen, for sharing your insights with us. And definitely, I think we are more convinced of the need of, really taking care of our psychological well-being. Yes. So thank you very much for your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the work that you're doing.